Hey, Victoria, welcome back. So we're back for
Hi.
another week, another episode in a row because we finished the last episode off with where I think we both felt like there was more we could say in terms of how to actually cope with the things that we were describing that we've been noticing
Mhm.
people feeling. You notice your clients experiencing with the lockdown. I've noticed my patients experiencing with the lockdowns, not even just the lockdowns, the entire year of the pandemic, you know. I think
Mhm.
lockdown is just one
Mhm.
aspect of it, but there's a lot of different things to consider that people are experiencing, right? Like that are causing strife and suffering and worry for people. So we sort of highlighted some of the things that people might be experiencing. You did a really good job of going deeper and actually naming things and almost, I don't want to say diagnosing, but there was like pattern recognition in some of the things you're talking about and how you were validating these experiences, like the cognitive load piece and this idea of lost identity or aspects of our identity, like all these things that we all can feel but probably don't even notice until someone points it out. So that's so helpful.
Mhm.
And then we left off kind of being like, all right. So
So
I'm
now
validated.
what?
Yeah.
Okay, go to bed, go to sleep with all of those thoughts.
Yeah, now you know why you feel terrible. Good luck.
Mhm.
But then we
Mhm.
started thinking, you did a lot of thinking and you came up with some things for us to talk about to help people cope, to help ourselves cope and to share the coping. So, and you want to read your list? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have a table of contents. Feel free to skip to what you'd like. No, but we have validate and normalize. I know we talked about that a lot. Self-care, what does it mean? Why, when are you allowed to engage in self-care? What does that look like for you? I think that's something that's thrown out all the time and it's just a general term, but let's get specific with it.
Mhm.
This was something that we mentioned a lot, but we can hone down in on, which is boundaries, unplugged transitions.
Mhm.
Mindfulness, staying present, how to manage uncertainty, uh, how to find meaning and purpose. And that doesn't mean that we're justifying suffering that's happening or deaths that are happening. It's more, how do we move beyond a fear based response all the time?
Mhm.
Um, Values over goals and why that's important to choose that. Coping with the lack of physical touch. I know we mentioned that that's a struggle. It's hard to locate, but once we do locate it, what can we do about it? Remembering who you are, accessing your identity, since we talked about that identity piece, and then seeking help and connection in new ways.
This is
So
good.
a nice 10,
Yeah.
nice number.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, when you sent that to me, I was like, oh, and even just hearing it listed, I'm like, oh, we have so much to talk about. This is going to be good.
Yeah, we do. We do.
Yeah. And so how
Okay.
did the list just get generated as you thought about our conversation? Um, because I know, yeah, you were thinking about it a lot and coming up with ideas throughout the last week.
It's a mix of both. Yeah, it's I was on global news right when the pandemic started happening and there was a lot of panic, so there was a lot of how do we deal with this uncertainty? How do we deal with this change? So I thought a little bit about that when I went there. And then with speaking with clients, I've been noticing what's been helpful for them and what we've been landing on as well. And then also our talk just helped and I just went
Yeah.
keep going.
Like, let's distill it down to 10 categories. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's start with the first one. Let's get into it. Because I know some of them we're probably going to talk
Okay.
for a while on. Some of them may just be like common
Yes.
sense kind of thing. But yeah,
Yeah.
so let's go. Let's.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so the first piece, I mean, we talked about this all last session, is validate and normalize. Why is it important? That might seem like just a lazy thing to say, but again, we talked about cleaning up the house, right? Walking into the house and organizing everything going on is like organizing what's going on in your mind, putting labels to it. And all of a sudden, even though there's still the same stuff in the house, it's a little less overwhelming to walk into. It allows you to realize where you need to put a plant or where you need to put a chair. It helps us to depersonalize what's going on, either because it's not our fault, or if it's our fault, it's just because we're humans. I think there's this quote that I really like, which is an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is a normal reaction,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it allows us to reduce that cognitive load, to reduce the the amount of, we only have a certain amount of resources that we can handle in a day. And if one of those resources is being sucked out from your critical self-talk,
Mm-hmm.
then that's not good. So it leaves up more resources for you, and it allows you to be able to respond to your needs. If I can identify that I feel out of control, then I need to focus on the things that I can control in my life. Or if I know that I'm feeling burnt out and I know that that's okay and it's a human thing, I can stop pushing myself and allow myself to take a nap.
Yeah.
Right? So that's just the first I know we covered that. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's any more that you
Mm-hmm.
have to add on to that, but that's really the first category that opens us all up to allowing ourselves to let in the rest of the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, and I think like from the last conversation we had, that was like one of the first things you said when I was like, okay, like I feel like we're I think too, like the difference between maybe even how not even my profession, but how my practice is set up versus your practice is I think I need to, or I feel at least internal pressure and possibly actual pressure to like come up with a solution quickly because it's like I'm a like
Hmm.
a essentially like a naturopathic doctor. It's sort of like okay, here's the plan, versus seeing someone weekly where we're sort of okay, let's spend a few sessions to kind of look at the house. And so um when you were like, okay, one of the first things I do is just remind people that we're in a pandemic. And that's like what sometimes maybe that might be it, and that might just kind of
Hmm.
reroute whatever's happening. But then I also love when you were like, an, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is a normal reaction. Is that what you said? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah. It's like two negatives,
Yeah.
the double negative that makes positive. But I think that makes a lot of sense. It's like we've never done this before, so how do we even
Hmm.
know what is a normal reaction, anyways? So
Exactly.
if
It also allows us to manage our expectations.
mhm,
If you know what's going on for you, if you can identify that, then you can stop expecting so much from yourself in this time.
mhm. How much would you say like when you see a new client? I know it obviously varies, but how much
Hmm.
time or like what would you expect would be would be normal, I guess, or common? um how much of that interaction is spent just in validation and normalization? Like how big? Because I think you know even like from my messaging and what I talk about with people, even my own clinical perspective, I'm like, oh, but it's just normalization or it's just validation. Like I need to do something. But I think that we can sometimes bypass that quickly and not really linger in the benefit of that has for someone, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah, I also think it depends on where someone comes from. So you have to identify what your insecurities are, how you grew up. Did you grow up in a household that spoke about emotions openly, or did you grow up in one that was hush hush under the rug, or said, don't cry about it, grow up, right? So if you can identify that that's a specific pain for you to not be seen or to feel like you're not allowed to feel emotions, then that can be even more part of your treatment. That's an important piece. That's a radical act of self-love for yourself
Mhm.
that will be helpful for you versus someone who grew up, they were allowed to talk about their emotions. Maybe that's an important piece, but it's on the way to just figuring out your story, or making connections in other ways to take action.
Mhm. Yeah, it may not necessarily be a new experience for you to really feel validation and that your experience is normalized. And
Hmm.
for someone that might be a lot, that might be their self-care, because we'll get into self-care later, but that might be
Yeah.
like a huge thing. It's just having like a little note in your pocket that says we're in a pandemic, we're in a pandemic, a little reminder going off on your phone, we're in a
Exactly.
pandemic. Like
Yeah.
that might be it, for someone. um
Yeah. Yeah.
mhm,
So people could do this exercise of, how did I learn about emotions growing up? what emotions were acceptable for me and what emotions weren't. When I was hurt emotionally, did I feel safe to go to someone?
Mm.
Who did I go to? How did I talk about it? How did they respond to me? And based on that response, how did I over time learn to carry that emotion or express that emotion? And if you ask yourself those questions and you learn about yourself in that way, you'll be able to catch things. Maybe you're good with sadness, maybe you're good with feeling lonely and you can validate that, but maybe it's like the anger that you're afraid of and that you need to release and validate. So it's also specific, and you need to tweak certain points with that too.
Mm-hmm. This is so good. Yeah. All right. Number two.
Okay. Number two is self care. Now, everything we're going to be talking about is a form of self care, but let's just talk about allowing ourselves to engage in self care. I think there's, especially with a society that we're in where it's really hard to slow down, we define ourselves a lot by our productivity and our ability to work. What does it mean to engage in self care? So, are you familiar with the airplane metaphor
Put
of
your
self care?
oxygen mask on first.
Yes.
Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. So, just for everyone else, when you go on an airplane, they will tell you to secure your oxygen mask in case of emergency before you secure others. And why is that? I know you know the answer. It's because if you spend time trying to secure someone else, you're not going to get input of oxygen and you're both going to pass out before either of you put your mask on. And I think that's really hard, especially for working parents or single parents or parents that are dealing with kids at home all the time. It can be really exhausting. And I think there's a lot of guilt in taking self care, even if you're not a parent or if you're a healthcare worker and you have to be on all the time, right? But we have to remember as we're going into this that it is so fundamental to functioning.
Mhm.
You need to fill up your tank. And I'm a very visual person. So the other thing I'm going to say, this is my own metaphor that I make up. You know those Formula One racers or NASCAR drivers? I don't know the difference,
Yeah.
but I know that when I see those races and they stop for the pit crew to fix their cars, I always get this anxiety. I'm like, no, all the cars are passing you. But they've obviously calculated that stopping is
Uh-huh.
helpful and needed to continue the race, right? So even when it feels wrong, even when it seems like everyone's passing you or you're forgetting things, stopping and getting
Yeah.
your own pit crew like is so important for sustainability.
I'm
So
actually really excited by that metaphor because I think that's like that's really captures it because I think that's even where I get stuck in helping someone with their own self-care journey or a group of people I'm leading because I think that we are in that experience of in a race, like there's an intense amount of time
yeah.
pressure and it doesn't feel
Mhm.
like I can go have a bubble bath or go talk to my sister for 2 hours on the phone or linger in whatever thing feels restorative or even do the basic like maintenance on the car. It feels like you're falling behind or that there just isn't time. But I think that
Mhm.
that's a great metaphor because like the car is, I mean, in the Formula One example, it's life threatening to not do the pet stop, and then they've calculated it, which is really interesting because that's this element that we don't that maybe requires some attention to. And working with someone is like, okay, let's calculate it. If you
Mhm.
go 8 hours without having a meal because you need to go or drinking water, what does that do for your productivity or your ability to get the other things done that you have to do later on? Like how do you sort of build your energy and momentum? How do you repair your car so that you can, I don't even know if you want to win the race. You want to just finish the race,
Yeah.
do the race. Like I don't know. And
Yeah.
but that's actually so interesting because it really opens up a lot of possibilities for um, understanding the problem and framing the solution in a different way. That it's
Mhm.
not just like I can't stop Victoria because I'm literally getting passed by all these people. There's crowds screaming, but your wheels are falling off. You're not going to be able to complete the race anyway.
Yeah.
So
I think that's another thing to be conscious of is I notice that people will always tell themselves there's a reason not to stop.
mhm,
Whether it's guilt motivating you, whether it's comparison, that race narrative, there's always, if your mind is in an anxious state, it's always going to find something to fill in the blank as to why you're not allowed to rest.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. There's always something
And
you
one
could be
thing that
doing
you'll
or should
notice,
be. Yeah.
yeah, one thing, especially when it comes to, let's say, turning your mind off and going through meditation, when people first start meditation classes, they'll notice that after they go through it, they experience the meditation, they'll feel exhausted. But then over time, it'll start to feel revitalizing. And the reason is because you have your sympathetic nervous system on all the time. And when you finally switch it to the parasympathetic, you're going to crash because it's been so long since you've allowed yourself to fully rest. But
Mhm.
then over time, as you do these little pit stops, it feels like an energizing experience. So that's also one thing to
Mhm.
notice. Some people, they might engage in that self-care, it might make them crash, and that's for good reason.
Mhm.
And then they'll feel like, oh, this is why I don't do this, because I stop completely. But that's actually just more validation that this is what you should be doing. You just haven't done it
Mhm.
for a long time. So if you do experience a crashing period, don't feel guilty about it. Embrace it. And then just remember to keep that self care more consistent next time.
That's actually a good point. I hear that all the time when we're working with sleep, as an example. Someone will say,
Yeah.
I got crappy 6 hour lack of quality sleep for so long. And now, Talia, thank you so much for helping me sleep longer. But now I don't feel as restored. Well, it's not like they felt restored with the 6 hours, but they're like, I feel almost less restored at with 8 hours of sleep. And so the conversation
Hmm.
is, yeah, it's because probably a similar effect where now the body is able to switch more into parasympathetic. That's one way of analyzing it, but another way is like the body's like, oh my gosh, there must be more where this came from, and I need to pay back debt
Hmm.
to sleep. And similar thing happens when we skip a few meals in the day and then finally sit down to eat, and then we're like, I need all the sugar and all the chips, and it's really just the body being like, okay, it's eating time, let's get our 2,500 calories or whatever we need. So I think that's an interesting thing to point out. It's like once you sit down, you might feel that crash. Um, and that's not a sign that
Yeah,
it's
it's a
not
swinging of
working.
the pendulum.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Yeah. And if you've
yeah.
been
If
stuck
you
here,
push yourself,
yeah.
it's going to swing back the other way. And then if you are stuck in that exhaustion and not moving, you're going to feel that guilt and you're going to push yourself into the other extreme. And it becomes this very black and white experience instead of
Mm.
learning to let the pendulum settle in the middle and sit in this moderation. So it's going to be a trial and error for you. You're not going to get it right the first time, right? But trust that this is something that you need.
Hmm. Yeah. Like if you look at like a dog or a little kid just in a field and you're like, they sometimes spurt, they sometimes sit down, they sometimes run, they sometimes stop, and that's like someone who's more in a flow of energy. But when we're like,
Uh-huh.
yeah, but if you're just like go go go, run
I
run run,
love that.
yeah. Yeah, but if I'm
Yeah.
like pushing myself to run 4 hours, I'm probably going to need to lie down for 4 hours or 6 or 8 or whatever to
Yeah.
make up for it. So um yeah, so flowing, I think. Now, okay, with self care, I'm trying to think what I bump up against a lot. Because self care, first of all, how would you define it? Because I think the first thing that comes to mind is like pedicures, bubble baths. Like it's more like aesthetic
Yeah.
pampering, I think gets confused with self care. Um, and I wonder how you help somebody identify even maybe like their top three, you know, um,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
what is it? Yeah. Mm.
I I think that's a really valid thing to say because, yeah, I think it's brought out self care, but what really is it? We need to define it. I put it into six different categories.
Mm.
So the categories that I put it into are psychological, emotional, uh, what else do I put it into? Physical, social. I have a mindful slash spiritual, depending on if you identify as religious or not,
Mm.
and other. So the psychological self-care is something that gives you a break from having that heavy cognitive load all the time. So that's like you're
Mm.
allowed to my permission to allow you to zone out and dissociate if you need to, right? That's watching Netflix, getting into a good book, just anything that takes you away from this heavy, constant rumination thinking process. The emotional self care is the other side of that piece. So that would be something that allows you to finally address accept, process,
Mm.
feel your emotions and what's going on for you so that you can release it. Something like a catharsis. So getting into art, or, listening to a sad song and finally having that good cry that's been building up over time. Then we have the mindful and spiritual, which I'll just say, whether or not you're religious, is something that connects you to a sense of wonder and life that's bigger than you are, right? That
Mhm.
you're a part of this life. So that could be praying, but it could also be a walk in nature,
Mhm.
playing with your dog,
Yeah.
And then we have the social self care. So making sure that you're talking to your friends, having a sense of intimacy, physical self care. A lot of people will right away, they'll go to pedicures or they'll go to exercise, but that also means getting in the right nutrients. It means sleep hygiene. And then the category that I have is other. I've always put it as other just for people to put whatever feels like it
Mhm.
doesn't fit in the box. But I've been noticing that boundaries goes
Interesting.
in that category, and it's
Mhm.
so important. Allowing yourself to say no, have boundaries between rest and transition. And that just goes into our next category of boundaries around the news,
Mhm.
boundaries around your workspace, and the different activities that you engage in.
This is good. Yeah. I love how they actually all do transition really nicely too. You could put them in a good order as well.
Yeah, it wasn't on purpose. It was just like, oh wow.
You're like, what's coming up
But
next? And yeah. That's
yeah,
great. Go ahead. Go ahead.
uh, if you're looking to understand more about what self-care would look like for you, draw those boxes, write as much of the ideas as you can, and then look at it and see what's blank. And you'll notice that you have something that you emphasize more than the others, and it might mean that you need to balance them out a little bit more.
Mm.
Like, we may engage in a lot of mental zoning out, like there's a lot of watching Netflix, and it's like, okay, if I notice that I'm doing that a lot this week, then maybe that means I need to transition into the feeling piece, or vice versa. There's some people who are really flooded, and it's like, no, you need
Mm.
to write it all out, look at it really, and then you can sort through it.
That's actually, I'm gonna do that actually after we after we end the call. And it's actually providing so much insight even into um the Health Foundations group I led a couple months ago, because there were different categories, and there was some focus on like a lot of it was body care, like physical self-care. And there were a lot of people who felt uh, overwhelmed by that. And I think it was interesting because if I zoom out a little bit, I was like, maybe they were also overemphasizing or giving too much importance. Like, I personally can also relate to that, maybe giving too much importance to that one category. There's a lot in that
Mm-hmm.
category, like eating and exercise and that kind of thing, sleep hygiene. That's like enough for like a full-time job to just like get those things right in modern society.
Yeah.
But what was happening, there was this guilt and shame and perfectionism, and you see that maybe that there was a need for more psychological self-care in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really interesting to just frame it like that. It's like, oh, like one box was pretty full and also being overemphasized, and there's a lot being done in that box already. Maybe it's time to shift to another box and see what's in there, and if we can strengthen it. Maybe that was the problem of that feeling overwhelmed, because the psychological self-care needed some attention. Maybe actually
Yeah.
over focusing on one box was robbing another box, you know. Um,
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly.
and so that's interesting. Yeah, because, and also too, I'll get into, like, I don't know, I'll binge watch some Netflix thing and then feel kind of shameful about it, but then I'll be like, oh no, no, this is good. And I think just having those boxes can help with that piece of like, oh no, it's all going according to plan. I'm doing my psychological self-care. I'm not losing out on, because I think that might be part of my cognitive uh piece, or some of my schemas, that like, oh, I'm there's a waste of time, this is unproductive. But it's like, no, no, this is my psychological self-care. The other pieces are going to be attended to. I have a bit of a plan around it, or some awareness around it, or seeing how it all fits together. I think it could be
Mm-hmm.
really helpful. As I'm speaking, I'm like, oh, I have so much like need for like control and planning, but maybe that's helpful too, to just like, like I want to write stuff into boxes. Can't wait.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you gotta, I mean, you gotta give something for the different personalities. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You can just like flow with your self-care. But I think that's great. Yeah. I love that because it opens up possibilities of what self-care could be for someone, you know,
Mhm.
and even just, yeah, that formula combined with the Formula One metaphor, it's like, oh, maybe, you know, my walk in nature. I have a patient that calls it her non-negotiables, right? So like her daily non-negotiables, or even we also zoom out to like weekly, monthly, yearly. Like, do you, at what point do you feel like you need to take some space from life, like go on a trip or something? Or what do you need monthly, what do you need yearly? Like, how do we kind of frame those needs when we start to feel burnout impending? But um yeah. So the next thing was boundaries. So number 3 on the list is
Yes. Yeah. So we talked about this a lot last podcast episode, about, I mean, we talked about two things. We talked about how we need boundaries around news consumption, the impact of having the news constantly on our minds, projected at us, being in this anxious state all the time, having to think about it, what that means. And we also talked about the floating feeling of not having boundaries in the house,
Mhm.
because our entire ecosystem of everything we do is in the house. And so, am I working? Am I sleeping? And then, I'll start there first. Intention. So, with the news, intention around when you choose to consume it and for what reason you're consuming it, what time of day, how that affects you, how much you are capable of taking in. Take note of that, become more conscious of that. When it comes to boundaries in the home, I know you talked about a client that took walks, a 5-minute walk before work and after work to signal her commute. I think that's excellent. I
Mm.
think that's great. So if you can find something tangible, whatever that means for you, putting on, you also talked about the woman who wore like a hat,
To
when she
church,
was
yeah.
going to church, Zoom church. And that too, whatever can be something that your body can tether to help you switch.
Mhm.
And I think like one thing that people really struggle with, for example, is exercise. And I want to say that sometimes when you're doing an activity, people expect to have a motivation first in order to
Mhm.
lead to the activity, but that doesn't usually happen.
Mhm.
Usually you have to actually allow yourself to be sort of a zombie, to go through the motions step by step, one at a time, and then your body will start to connect to the cues in the environment and to what you're doing with it, and then it will start to engross itself in
Mhm.
the activity. So an example with exercise would be, just put on your exercise clothes, tie your hair up,
Mhm.
and just walk around the house. You could cook with it on. Get your body starting to become accustomed to it. And then even if you still don't feel like it, now you're a little bit ready to just put on your shoes,
Mm.
right? And then you could tell yourself, I'm just going to go for a 1-minute walk and I can stop then. And
Mhm.
so the two things, right? So something tangible for you, and also doing it step by step to
Mhm.
get that motivation.
Break it down into pieces. Yeah. Don't look at the whole
Yeah.
mountain in front of you and be like, I'm imagining myself mid run, sweaty, whereas I currently feel exhausted and maybe a bit dizzy and maybe a bit like just like tired, and and so it's like I can't imagine my current state ending up in that at the top of that mountain. But you're like, but the first step is just,
Mhm.
it's, you're not going to go there from there really quickly. There's a whole progression. So the first step might just be tying up your hair and standing up, and shoes, and as
Mhm.
you start doing that, you start making the body starts to build some motion and momentum, and maybe you never get to the full out sprint, but now you're like, you walked for a minute, and that's good. So it's,
Mhm.
yeah, it's hard to, it's also, I've been thinking about this a lot, like in terms of motivation, um because
Mhm.
I think what I always find is when we have the impossible task, which I'm going to talk more on like in other podcasts and things, this idea of the impossible task that characterizes like a shutdown state, or depression, or low motivation, um, we often are stuck at one of the pieces of that task. Like one of
Mhm.
my friends actually was like, she's like, the idea of putting on socks and then shoes, for some reason, that was just like
Yeah.
an obstacle, like a mental obstacle. For me, if I think of like going, like taking my bike instead of public transit or something, it's like getting my bike up the incline in the underground garage. It's that, just that image of that. I'm like, oh no, I'll just do something else. So I think sometimes it's like that. Um, but often
Mhm.
too, we're also remembering maybe the first or second time that we've tried to do something. So like meal prep or exercise. And because it was one of the first times, and we weren't used to it, and we didn't really know how it was going to go, and we didn't have experience, and we hadn't built our skills yet, it goes way worse than it will go in the future. Like, you didn't know what
Mhm.
container to put the peas in, and you didn't know how long to cook the chicken for, and so it didn't go perfectly. But the next time, now you know, and so it's not going to be as bad. And same with exercise. Like, oh, the first time I did that yoga flow, it was awful, but once your body starts to get used to the movements, it's not as bad. And I think that's part of it too. It's like how we project what it will be like, can sometimes be an obstacle too.
Yeah, I think it's the all or nothing thinking and managing expectations that you're referring to, but I also think
Mm,
our mind is primed to think about negative experiences, right? That's part of survival in the savannah. We're going to eat a poisonous berry and we're going to need to remember that, right?
yeah.
So we often forget to store the positive memories. And so, for example, you think about exercising, as soon as you're finished, you're like, oh, I'm going to hop in the shower. It's done.
Hmm.
Why not take a moment, lie down, feel how
Mm,
your muscles feel? Take a survey of how you feel about yourself. What's your level of stress now? Do you feel proud that you meal prepped?
mm-hmm.
Right? And if you try to take a moment to store the positive memories, your motivation doesn't have to be that image of you in the garage. It becomes you after feeling great.
Hmm. Hmm.
So almost changing the relationship that you have in that way.
Hmm. That image is not me hauling my bike, like all confused, getting bicycle grease on me up the thing, but mid bike ride, feeling free and open and energized, and I'm
Mm.
like doing all these good things to the environment, and this is the best way to transport myself. It's like keep linger in that image so that it's also
Mhm.
becoming strengthened. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
The other thing with boundaries, I want to talk about boundaries around the virus. We were mentioning
Mm,
this before we started recording, but you were saying how this virus is not a stimulus that we can see, right? When you're in the savannah, you have a bear pop out of the woods, and that's fear and anxiety provoking. You get your fight, flight, or freeze system going, and your body is mobilized to do something about it. So you either fight it, you run away, and then the stimulus goes away. But the virus is invisible,
mm-hmm.
and we're being told about it. And so there aren't actually explicit stimuli telling us when we're safe and when we're not. And we might have to make that a conscious thing for ourselves. So, like you were saying, if you're standing 6 feet apart, you're wearing a mask, you're outside, okay, you're likely safe. I mean, I want to be careful because I'm not in the
Yeah.
medical field, but or if you're stepping into your home, especially for service workers who are out there and they have to be conscious all the time, when you step into your home, it might be helpful to take a moment and ground yourself and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
what do I see? What do I hear? What do I smell? Okay, this means that I'm home. I can signal to my body that I'm home. Okay, I am safe. This
Mm-hmm.
is a restful period. The
Mm-hmm.
virus is not around here, or the likelihood of it is not around here in my home.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a big topic, because there is no guarantee, but that doesn't
Yeah.
mean, and no certainty, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we can't still self-soothe or attend to those cognitions, like that cognitive behavior therapy, like find a more balanced thought type thing. So I think it's hard because some of my patients who deal with health anxiety, we can never really
Mhm.
get a certain, and that's often what they're looking for, and they're often coming to me because they want the authority to tell them, you do not have this thing you think you have. And it's difficult for a practitioner who's like a health care practitioner, not necessarily doing psychotherapy, to be like, okay, because you want to also honor, and I think this is important. It's like we we want to honor a few levels. Like we have rules and mandates, right? Um, we also have our and so it's like, okay, we want to honor that. And so there's certain safety precautions, right? Masking, social distancing, don't go to restaurants, don't go to crowded events. Then we have another layer of like our sphere of influence, like how can I protect them, and what's my influence in helping them stay safe, and then my personal, what specific needs do I have that might require me to be safe, and
Yeah.
where can I know that I'm personally following, we call it like following the rules, but yeah, I guess it could be like your own personal rules or mandates or what you feel is a precaution. I think like the bicycle analogy might like take a bit of the load off, because I always feel like it's loaded to talk about the virus, but like biking, it's like you
Yeah.
know that there are risks to biking. No one can tell you 100% that like you're going to be 100% safe. That's just not a certainty. But we definitely know that that there are things we can do um, to be safer and to be more cautious and to be
Mhm.
more responsible cyclists. And there still may be people that despite all that decide never to bike because the uncertainty is too, or the risk is too high for them personally. But then there's many more people who are like, well, I'm going to bike because I know I'm doing my best to stay safe, and I'm going to assume that tiny risk. So it's hard because we're fed, there's just nothing that can be said, like, a friend was talking about the variants,
Mhm.
and we see younger people, and so there's just nothing to guarantee um that. And we were talking about this before, right? Like, even so, like from a personal perspective, where I'm like, well, I personally trust my immune system and what I'm doing to stay safe, but there's absolutely no guarantee. And to
Yeah.
sit in the uncertain part of it feels uncomfortable, like really not great. And so I think I have to, just from my own experience, spend less time lingering in the chance that everything could go to hell, and so more time being like, hey, what am I doing that's helpful? What are the you probably better language around this, but what are the things that I'm doing to stay safe, that are contributing more to the side of my safety, of me and those around me who I'm
Mhm.
influencing, who I'm affecting. And it's a tricky thing, but I think, yeah.
I think that's a really great point, right? And that just goes to how yeah, it's so hard to create those boundaries. And you could carry that anxiety everywhere. You could carry it into your bedroom when you're trying to sleep at night because you are never sure how safe you are. And so you
Yes.
have to, again, like the pit stop, you have to know that it's not sustainable to have your fight or flight system on at all times. And
Mhm.
like you said, to find some type of stability in the uncertainty, to say, based on all the parameters, based on the context, based on what I'm doing to keep safe. Mm,
Mhm.
yeah, it's hard. Even when I'm saying it, I
Yeah,
can hear
right.
that it's hard to say.
I think
Yeah.
too, like, it's hard to
Yeah.
have this conversation, I think, because I'm always afraid that I'll sound cavalier about the risks, right? And like I'm like
Yes.
downplaying
Yeah.
the risk, because I think that that's a problem too, is part of the narrative of everything that's going on, is that there is this dichotomy. It's like the people that follow rules and the people that don't care at all. And
Mm,
so I'm scared of ending up on one side of it, just from what I'm saying. But this is what we're
mhm,
talking about, is that it's not about being cavalier or not caring. It's about, it's like the bike thing. It's like, just because I have my bike helmet, I know my bike rules, I'm in a bike lane, but I'm not just like, you know, So I'm doing all those things. And just because I'm on a bike doesn't mean I'm just like in the middle of the road, like whatever, weaving in and out of traffic. Like I still like, respect that there's risks, but as a cyclist, I can't focus on the risks when I'm doing the right things, you know? And is there more I could be doing? Does a responsible cyclist still make mistakes? Of course.
Yeah.
But, you know, and are there other unseen factors? Of course. But as I'm cycling in the bike lane, I've got my helmet on and I'm, you know, I've got to uh, focus on other things rather than the risk of getting hit by a car, no matter what.
Mhm.
It's yeah, I don't know. It's a tough thing. I don't even know if I'm coming across properly with it, but I I think it's hard, and I don't know what the solution is for the specific person who feels overwhelmed by the fear and
Yeah.
uncertainty. Um,
Mhm.
but I have also felt like it's come in and out. My personal fear of the virus has ebbed and flowed, and when it when it ebbs, it's very uncomfortable and unpleasant, and it's hard to manage those
Mm.
feelings too. And I think, yeah, I don't know if you have some recommendations around that. I know like turning off the news has been helpful to just be like, okay, let's think about
Mhm.
something else. Let's not think about COVID. COVID's not here. It's not in my room right now. It's just me and Coco
Yeah.
here right now. And yeah.
That's what I mean, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Is COVID living in my bedroom right
Mm-hmm.
now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What does that mean, right? Like it's different if you're going out into public. That's a different story.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's only so much you can control in your house.
Yeah.
So to be in that state, it is really hard. It's so hard to be in that state, and when the outside world feels unsafe, when your inside world feels unsafe,
Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
hard.
I mean, that's why I keep harping a little bit on Instagram about the risk of outdoor transmission being low, because it's counterintuitive for people that don't know much about viruses, right? Because you feel like
Mhm.
outside where there's people, there's is more, it feels more dangerous. But so just providing facts sometimes can help provide context, that when you're outside and there's fresh air between people, the there's more movement, there's more of a chance that something won't be transmitted from one person to another. It'll just be sort of swept away by the air. And we have data on this. And so sometimes just grounding in certain facts can help. I mean, there's always uncertainty with the facts, though, too. So it's like, yeah. But I
Mhm.
think to say like, okay, I'm safe right now. Like, I love your like, you know, what can I see? What can I hear? What can I feel? Like just grounding into the present, because I think most of our
Mhm.
fears and that chronic low grade anxiety are based on, you know, future projections or past ruminations. And so being able to just like, okay, what is happening right now? My body is safe. My mind doesn't feel safe, but my body is. If I can ground into the present,
Yeah.
I can ground into a sense of safety right now. Like um John Kabat-Zinn says, like, as long as you're breathing, there's more right with you than wrong with you. You know?
Oh, that's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah, because you're like,
That's
okay,
perfectly
yeah.
you're gonna laugh, but the next thing that was on my list was mindfulness.
Oh, amazing. Here we go. Yeah, that's so good.
And I think that you made that point. I think that that's perfect. It's our information is always changing. Every day is changing.
Hmm.
We're getting news updates. We're getting new ideas on where we're at in terms of rates and
Yeah.
what to do next. And so you have to take some things day by day, because
Hmm.
that's all you can do. Because, you know, if you were to project and to predict the future from the information that you get in this particular day, that's going to be a vastly different looking future than the information that we get a month from now. It's
Yeah.
just impossible. And then, like you said, your mind can go anywhere, but your body is always grounded in the present moment. So yes, accessing the five senses. There's lots of activities that you can do that. I think cooking is a good one. Showers are great for those senses. Going on a mindfulness walk. It's all something that is important, is to be in your body sometimes, away
Yeah.
from your mind.
Yeah. This is all good. Yeah. Which leads us to mindfulness, which is one way we can ground the
Yeah,
body.
yeah.
Yeah. or be aware of the
Hmm.
contents of the mind as mere contents and
Yeah.
not truth, capital T truths. Hmm.
But that is very body heavy. So what
Hmm.
does mindfulness look like mentally? So there's
Hmm.
some specific principles to mindfulness. There's non-judging, which is being in a state where you're just receiving the moment as it is. There's no labeling as good or bad or should or shouldn't. There's also this idea of decentering, and what that means is seeing yourself as a stable, unchanging being, whatever that means, in a moving world. So, your cells change. Your cells were different when you were a child and than the cells that you have now. Sometimes you have up days, sometimes you have down days. What stays consistent is you, a sense of you throughout all of it. I know that's really abstract.
Hmm.
There's also non-striving. So we have the being mind versus the doing mind. We live in a very doing society, goal-oriented, activity, go, 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 motivation. But we also need to have a balance with the being mind, which is like allowing us to reap the benefits of our rewards, not be goal-oriented and receive what we have right now, and gratitude. Those are all being-oriented things. There's acceptance. They all kind of flow into each other, acceptance for where you're at, receiving things in the moment in that way instead of trying to force yourself to feel a certain way. And then there's the beginner's mind, sort of different from maybe other things we're talking about, but seeing mundane things that you're used to seeing from a new point of view. So that could be from a child's
Hmm.
perspective, from the perspective of a curious scientist. There's that whole experiment of, oh, what is it? It's like, who's on the $20 bill in Canada? It's like, we
Yeah.
look at $20 bills every day. I don't know if I remember.
Exactly. Yeah.
um,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
So
that's actually really
so it's
good.
like looking at it, looking at things in a new way, and just it's all essentially under the label of moving from doing to being. What can you receive in this moment?
Hmm. Yeah. It's like, was it awareness in the present moment without judgment is like,
Hmm.
there's self compassion kind of gets added to that because there's that extra layer. Like, it's not just about being this like kind of automaton who doesn't react. It's also this, there is an emotion too that's helpful
Hmm.
to bring in. Um, yeah, I wanted to say too, because one of the things that patients who are experiencing anxiety, I think, would be probably the category that I think this most applies to, that it most expresses to me, is that they're told to meditate, which is different from mindfulness. They're told to meditate, or they've heard that meditation is a good thing to do, and then they try it and they get something like a. So sometimes it works out really well and it's a wonderful tool. Sometimes though, they'll express to me that either they A, feel shut down, or B, feel more anxious, and in some cases feel panicky, and that meditation doesn't work in that same sense. So, and sometimes I feel like that as well. I feel like the sitting on a cushion kind of thing still somehow isn't what I want to do, or doesn't feel helpful. How, and so then it's like, well, we can be mindful in daily life, bringing those principles into whatever we're doing, which is very hard because it's so abstract to just kind of do your dishes mindfully when you don't have much experience meditating to experience what that state is kind of like. But one thing that I has been helpful for me, and this is what a lot of mindfulness teachers will say not to do. They'll be like, you can hear me talk and talk and talk, but you really have to sit and meditate to get the experience. But despite that, despite them saying that, I find that listening to podcasts on people like Ram Dass or Adyashanti or John Kabat-Zinn, and just sort of bathing in their wavelength helps me kind of bridge the gap between feeling like I'm in my doing mind, rumination kind of mind, and then actually sitting in meditation. There's this like midpoint where just to hear some of these concepts, even to hear you speak of these things, like there's something calming in it that I benefit from. So sometimes even just there's seems like a frame shift a little bit when you're hearing somebody speak a little bit more from that beginner's mind, or expressing some of these mindfulness concepts that feels a little bit to me like a brain massage. And so sometimes even that's
Ah,
helpful. Yeah,
it's almost like you're getting into like a co-regulation, right? Like
exactly.
we use social interaction as a way of emotionally regulating.
Yeah.
And we don't have a lot of access to that. So I think when you're talking about using a podcast to help
Mm-hmm.
regulate, I think that's really important. That might scratch
Mm-hmm.
a social itch and that
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness act. The other thing too is that it's like a muscle. Your
Right.
brain is like a muscle, right? The more you use it, the easier it gets. So I think when people expect themselves, there's a lot of myths that come around meditation, like the idea that you're not supposed to have a thought, any thought
Right.
at all. I
Right.
mean, even the most practiced meditators will have thoughts come through because that's the sign of a natural working brain.
Yeah.
It's more so catching yourself. It's more about noticing and where your attention goes. Your attention is a really important resource that's being capitalized on right now, actually, especially when you consider social media and
Mm-hmm.
Netflix and everything pulling you around, and you're not often a conscious participant in where your attention goes. Meditation, I see, is almost more simply put as you deciding where your attention goes.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be you sitting down and just trying to have a Zen mind. But if you do choose that as well, you don't have to start at 10 minutes. You start at 1 minute, 1 minute a day of just stopping.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next week, increase to 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
There's no race, there's no amount that you have to do. It's just working that muscle. You wouldn't start with 50-pound weights, bicep
Right.
curls. I wouldn't do
Right.
it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So, why do we expect ourselves to do that for something that has just not been an available resource to us for so long, especially in the culture that we're in, that is very busy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. And I love that our attention is actually a commodity now in this day and age that people pay
Mm-hmm.
for. So it's very difficult to to have agency over it now. And so this is
Yeah.
like
And
a
now with
skill. Yeah,
the virus added as another
exactly.
thing that is demanding so much of our
Hmm.
attention.
Yeah, because I think when we talk about it, it's difficult when we say things like having boundaries around our where our mind goes, almost like this idea of being having agency over our mind and our thoughts. I think that skill can sound really abstract because like, well, I can't help what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
But being able to, yeah, like with mindfulness, it isn't about not having the thought. It's about watching how that thought shows up, the qualities of it, almost like a sensation upon your body, like a sound or an emotion that comes up. And there's a level of non-judgment and an observation quality. And there's a difference between being like lost and consumed by a thought and watching a thought. And like you said, um when we with mindfulness, it's not about like, oh, my mind is blank. It's recognizing when your attention's been pulled, or where it is, and that whole phenomenon. And um yeah. And
Which
I
is
think,
also
yeah.
why it's, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that there's different techniques. It's not just sitting in silence necessarily for a minute. You can do
Right.
breathing, breath work, and you can do like guided meditation. There's ways to ease into it. Like Headspace is a good way. It kind of guides you very slowly through the initial stages of what it would look like to practice mindfulness. But yeah, go ahead. What you were going to
Mhm.
say?
Yeah, I was going to say this is also another mechanism as to why validation and speaking about things out loud can feel so good, because it's a form of externalization. It's a form of separating yourself from the thoughts. So
Yeah.
another way to do that is you can have the thought, I'm worthless. Or you can preface that instead and say, right now, I'm having the thought that I'm worthless. And all of a sudden, it is something you're thinking
Mm.
about instead of something that's all consuming and defining you.
Yeah. Yeah, like it's narrative. That's one of my favorite aspects of narrative therapy is the externalization, because it's like, because that, and that's like the fun with narrative, um, is that then you can work with it. Like, oh, when does that thought I'm worthless visit? What would you like to do with it? What
Mm-hmm.
would you like? Do you want to change it? Do you want to get rid of it? What? So there's this space, and then you're no longer worthless. It's a thought that comes. Um,
Yeah, like, so going back to the virus, for example, if I'm feeling anxious about it and maybe I would have caught it or something like that, right? Okay, so I'm worried about that. When is that useful for it to arrive and when is it not? So if I'm having dinner with my family and that thought decides to visit me, there's nothing I can do about it in that moment. Dinner inside the home, with the people
mhm,
that you're supposed to be having dinner with. But and so you can say, okay, right now I'm having this thought.
mhm,
I acknowledge it. Do I want to play with this thought, or can I re-engage with mindfulness, with my senses back onto my dinner plate while I'm
mhm,
eating? Those are the types of little
mhm.
breaks or the little negotiations that we have with ourselves on how much we're carrying cognitively.
Yeah. And you've recognized that it's there. You don't, because sometimes we might just feel anxious for no reason and not know why.
Mhm.
So you can say, oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I was having this thought. I was thinking more about this. Yeah. And then maybe that thought visits at a time when it's useful because it's not all or nothing. So, and then we can engage with it differently. So that's actually good. Yeah. I love that example, you know? Yeah. Because and
Yeah.
also even at the dinner table, if you're there and that thought, some worrisome thoughts around getting the virus or spreading the virus visits, and then you say, okay, you've decided there's it's not a helpful thought right now. I want to focus on my mashed potatoes or talking to my son, and we disengage. Also knowing that that thought will probably come back again, and then it's another opportunity to
Mhm.
disengage. Or even if you've been lost in it, maybe for 10 minutes, that there's still another opportunity to disengage. So it's a renewing thing, and it's not so much um about you know being successful at it, or like, okay, it's gone now, it's never going to happen again. It's more about this constant relationship we have with our thoughts, feelings and emotions.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Because they're there for a reason. Those
Mhm.
thoughts exist and we can't push them away or punish them either. They're
Mhm.
there because they want us to be protected. They want us to feel safe. They want us to have the best life we can possibly have. And so
Yeah.
it's not about punishing them or pushing them away either. It's saying, okay, I hear you. I understand you. Right now, I don't need to mobilize that part of myself, but
Mhm.
I will listen to you after dinner when I need to check in on this, that, and that.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll use this to buy more hand sanitizer next time I go to the store. Like whatever the actual meaningful action. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Meaningful action. I like that.
This is good. Anything else on mindfulness you want to share? I think it's a whole topic and it's so important. Um,
I think it ties in. I mean, the
mhm.
next topic we have is managing uncertainty. And I think there's mindfulness that ties into
Yes.
that, of course,
This
right?
is
So,
good. Yeah.
with managing uncertainty, I want to be really careful because I want people to be able to harness their power when they can.
Mm,
It's important that in a world that feels very uncontrollable, that you focus on a lot of the things that you can
mm,
control. And at the same time, there is just so much going on. And even, the structure of today is no different than the structure of another day at any point in time in the universe. So
right.
every day carries the same amount of uncertainty actually, but
Right.
sometimes can feel more uncertain than others.
Yes.
And I guess where I'm getting with that is
Hmm.
just we have to learn how to cope with the amount of uncertainty. Is just it's being put more in our face now
Mhm.
than ever before.
Yeah. That's actually, I want to just like say that what you just said again, because I think that also ties back to what me blabbering before and not being able to articulate myself, but the bike riding analogy. Like every day carries the same amount of uncertainty as any other. That's, I think, very, for me at least, it gives me some space just to hear that. It gives me like a little bit of an exhale, like, right. It's just because I'm focusing on the level or the particular details of the uncertainty I'm facing right now doesn't necessarily change the overarching reality of the uncertainty of our existence. And not to be all metaphysical, but that is sometimes when it comes down to anxiety, um, health anxiety or any other kind, sometimes, you know, sometimes just recognizing how uncertain things are takes the weight off, because part of the anxiety, it's anxiety over uncertainty, but the other arm of it is a need then to control, to manage the uncertainty. And if you're like, the
Yes.
uncertainty is just unmanageable because it's just totally there all the time, it gives us a little bit of a, it gives me okay, well, some of that loads off my shoulders, you know?
Yeah, the first level of realizing that life is uncertain is terror. Like it's
Right,
not good. But the second level is freedom.
right.
It's like relieving. It's not trying to put yourself through, you know, the more you try to control something that's just not controllable, the more out of control and hopeless you feel.
Yeah.
And so there's a really great metaphor that I just tell everyone because I'm in love with it. It's this Tibetan Buddhist metaphor, and it's called like the old farmer metaphor. So this farmer, he has a horse and his horse runs away. And the neighbors who are watching this happen, they say, "Oh, how terrible that the horse has run away." And the farmer watching goes, maybe. And the horse returns the next day and brings back two other horses, and the farmer gets two free horses. And the neighbors watching say, "Oh my gosh, how amazing that you got more horses." And the farmer says, "Maybe." And then his son gets on one of the wild horses that were brought back, and it bucks him off and he breaks his leg. And the neighbors watching are, "Oh, how upsetting that your son broke his leg." And the farmer says, "Oh, maybe." And then the military comes in. They take all the young men to go fight in the war, but they don't take his son because he has a broken leg. And the neighbors go, "Oh, how lucky that your son was not taken." And the farmer says, "Maybe." And as you can see, this story will go on and on and on. And it's this idea that you could be like the neighbors and you could focus on each pinpoint in life as something that fully defines you and how you should feel in that moment. Or you can step back and have some space and notice that just like you can't predict when good things are going to happen, you can't predict when bad things are going to happen, and vice versa. And that life generally has this up and down flow to it. And for you to hold on to each defining moment is an exhausting roller coaster ride, rather than relinquishing some of that control over trying to evaluate these little moments in our life. Or what does it mean that we're in lockdown? Or what does it mean that this is happening, right? Or what does it mean that I did this at the grocery store? You will find out in time. And even in that moment, it will change.
Mm. I'm so excited that you brought up that story. I just
Yeah.
finished the book Why Yoga Works, by Michael Roach, and
Mm.
it is like a sort of a big story with of that, of the undulation of how it all ties together and planting seeds, and they bring in karma. They don't say karma, but it's this idea of planting seeds, um and I was thinking about that actually as I was thinking about this pandemic, that specific story, but I'm glad you memorized it and you know it. I'm like, wasn't that story about like a horse running away and then the broken leg, and how did it go? I don't know. It's so good. And I think that's so important because we're often taking a snapshot, you know, this company is doing so poorly, or this person is really upset, and none of that, not to invalidate any of that,
Yes, not to
or this
invalidate
company
it.
is
Yeah.
making billions of dollars off of the pandemic, like even these thoughts, these are lots of snapshots
Mhm.
that we weave into a narrative, but we're not seeing the individual threads of narrative of all of those stories. And so when you're fed like a photo album of different snapshots, you're going to come up with a narrative, and that might be an upsetting narrative, might be an uplifting one. And that's the interesting thing of in this book Why Yoga Works, it was the same thing. They were like, so you have to, so they use the example of, he holds up a pen and he's like, this is a pen to everyone, to you, to me, and he gives it to the cow and the cow eats it. He's like, it's not a pen to the cow. It's food. And so they use that as the example. But and he's like, so imagine, okay, something a little bit more controversial like war. Could somebody see, is war the same to everyone, or to someone is it like a completely different experience? And and I think that that's an interesting thing to bring up. It's sort of like a zooming out of zoom.
Yes, zooming out.
Mm-hmm.
Zooming out, because I think, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, I know we're at a different space now, but there was a lot of predicting because people were grasping for certainty. And I know, like, even I recently saw an article that called out the New York Times because they made a prediction that vaccines would come out in 2033. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's some,
Interesting.
it's like, even with all the information that we had at the time, they made that type of prediction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different now.
Mm-hmm.
And our information about the virus is constantly changing. Our information about human behavior and how we react
Yeah.
in healthcare is growing. Technology is exponential, and so to take a snapshot of where you are and to try to predict is just,
Mm-hmm.
it's never going to be completely accurate. It's very difficult, and so we end up exhausting ourselves with trying to find a place to land, trying to set a goalpost for the future when that goalpost keeps changing. I know we talked about that before, where it's exhausting when
Yeah.
it keeps changing. So there has to be part of us that also becomes, again, I don't want to take your power away, use that power where you can, and then part of us that relinquishes the control
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and finds solace in the fact that things change. You are in a bad day right now, in the same sense that you will be in a good day another day.
Mm-hmm.
The same unpredictability that we had before we could even imagine a pandemic starting, that unpredictability still exists to change what that pandemic could look like a year from now. So it's relieving ourselves of this responsibility to be more than human.
Mm-hmm.
If we could predict the future, I'd be a billionaire, fortune teller, I'd be famous, but I'm not. I'm human, right? And we have to remind ourselves of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is actually a really important concept that I never even thought of, is being aware. Like, if we're going to be, aware of our thoughts and sort of knowing what thoughts are maybe induce more suffering than others, the tendency to predict, because we talked all or nothing thinking and that kind of thing. But catastrophizing, but even just predicting, like, just even if it's neutral, because I think we just have to watch that. I don't want to be like we have to or we should, whatever, but it may be advisable to watch our prediction tendency. I'm also thinking of that farmer as like a surfer, like a surfer is not, you're not in the water being like, oh, a tsunami's gonna come, but you're looking at the horizon and you're seeing what's coming and you're getting ready. And very often you have to deal with the thing once it's there. Do I go over the top of this wave? Do I dive under because it's going to hit me? Do I turn around and paddle and try and ride it? Is there someone else on it? Who's there? Is this guy going for it? Do I pull back? And so so he's sort of like that. It's like, okay, the horse ran away. Oh, it's a wave that sort of passed by. And then the horse brought two waves. Is it related, or is it just another wave coming? And how do I just sort of, so he's very like equanimous in his like, maybe like it's, I'm just sort of, yeah, there are things that in the moment are bad and good, but when you zoom out, it's ends up not,
That's a really great point. There are going back to your bicycle analogy too, there are certain parts of our lives where we accept more of that. Maybe we allow ourselves to say that than other parts of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what are the skills that we use there that we can harness?
Hmm. Yeah, and I was thinking too, like, I mean, you don't have to be totally just maybe, like, right in the center, like something good happens and I
Hmm.
just whatever, and something bad happens and I whatever. But there is a sense of returning to flat water as the waves come, and so maybe we do allow ourselves joy when something good happens, and maybe we do allow ourselves to not just to grieve, like grieving is, I think, essential and important, but maybe we allow ourselves to feel despair and hopelessness and fear when something bad happens, but being able to harness the end, like it's a wave coming, and so that wave may feel intense and we can be there with it, but there's always an opportunity to zoom out and sort of see ourselves in the water and be like, well, I can see that, it's a constant changing state and it'll return to
Yeah,
equilibrium. Yeah.
it's not an emotional stuntedness. It's more of a trust in change as on our side than against us.
Mm,
Maybe something like that. Like
yeah.
there's a stability,
Hmm.
there's a deep stability in change.
Hmm. Trust. Yeah. I like it. You always frame it better.
Yeah.
I'm always like blabbering, and then you're like, you summarize. I'm like, damn, that's good. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, allowing yourself the emotional experience, perhaps, but yeah. And I think, yeah, we can say, oh, it's exciting when the horses come. Like more horses came, sweet. But does that excitement also come with a fear that now something bad will happen? So yeah, it's this equilibrium is helpful, I think, or the trust that okay, um, yeah, yeah, that's good. I love
Yeah.
that you brought that story up. I think that's so powerful. Yeah. Now
So
we're
I
yeah
think that you'll enjoy this next one,
yeah
which is meaning,
yes.
making meaning beyond, again, I have to reiterate, not justifying, I not saying everything happens for a reason. That may be your jam, but that's not other people's jam. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean it in that sense, but more so, how do I move beyond a fear-based response? How do I color my world again based on the circumstances that are happening?
Mm. Mhm.
So, are you familiar with Viktor Frankl?
I was just thinking about that book before we recorded because somebody on Instagram had taken a picture of it, and I remember being like, "I read that book and I liked it, but I didn't marinate in it in the same way that I feel others have." But yes, yeah, Man's Search for Meaning.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. Not to in any way compare the
Mhm.
Holocaust to anything that's happening now, but it is a really great book to talk about in this circumstances when there's a lot of uncontrollable aspects to our lives, when it can be hard to find meaning about what's going on, especially when there's suffering, there's death going on. So
Mhm.
Viktor Frankl was this Jewish psychologist who was a survivor of 4 concentration camps in total. He actually lost his pregnant wife
Mhm.
in a concentration camp, and I think a lot of other family members, and obviously he saw friends die and there's a lot of suffering. So he, in his first part of the book, he talks about his observation of, the psychological experience of being into concentration camp, and at the end he has, the second part of the book is he develops logotherapy, which is just this general guide to finding meaning in times of suffering for Holocaust survivors, but also for people who are struggling with grief and loss and other circumstances that might come in life. And finding meaning is a hard topic because it's very unique to you. It's very, I mean,
Mhm.
how do you, it's an abstract topic. People would love to be like, can I take a quiz? And that just tells me what the meaning to my
Yeah.
life is, but you can't do that. But there's two main questions that you can ask at least to start the process, just the thought process. The first one comes when there's nothing to expect from life. It's become boring and monotonous. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
And and Viktor Frankl says, ask yourself, what is life still expecting from you? So, in the same way that a loving caregiver cannot be replaced in the eyes of that child because it is that specific person and no other person can do that job,
Mm,
there is something unique and specific about you that is still being expected from you in this life,
mm,
even if you can expect something from it right now.
mhm,
So that can look like something that's day to day. Like, you know what, I check in on my friend because I know she struggles. That's where I'm fulfilling my expectation and meaning.
mhm,
And that could also look like 10 years from now saying, you know what, I'm still expected to be a grandparent and I want to be around, so I will stick around and I will have the stamina for that if
mhm,
I can be here mentally. So that's for that. The second thing is when we're asking more general questions like, what is the meaning of COVID? What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of the suffering that's going on? And what Frankl says is, it's not a general question. You have to ask yourself, who's asking? So, what he says is asking general questions of what's the meaning of something is sort of like asking what the best move in chess is. There is no best move. It all depends on the the pieces on the board, and the personality of the player, the personality of your opponent at that moment. And it will change as the game moves on. And so the meaning of something can change day by day, it can change week by week, and it is a specific intersection of where you are at that moment in time. So, who's asking?
mm,
So, those are the two.
mm.
It's a really hard topic to talk about, but these are some prompts that you can have for yourself as you go about trying to cultivate meaning in your life again.
Mm, those are great. Yeah. So, what is life expecting from you? And then,
Mm-hmm.
you know, who is asking the question when it comes to like, what's the meaning of life, or what's the purpose, or what does this all mean, or what's the point?
Mm-hmm. How do I
Yeah.
intersect
Hmm.
with life, with the pieces right now, and with who I am
Hmm.
in this moment?
Yeah. Looking at like a chess move, like, do I move up diagonally or to the side? It depends what's on the board, where we're at in the game, who I'm playing, my chess knowledge. Yeah. Because I'd be like, oh, straight.
Yeah, to be fair,
Yeah.
everyone teaches me chess, and then I play one game and then I lose, and then I forget chess again, and then it starts all over
Yeah, I don't have that,
again.
like, that. I guess I could like train my brain, but to like think a few moves ahead, I'm more just like, oh, I died. My queen's gone. There's no
Yeah,
point now.
yeah.
But I think, yeah, that's actually great because I think when I just had an image of somebody like in the midst of a difficult situation. And then if at that moment it's like they're being asked to find the meaning in it, it's not exactly what Viktor Frankl or you or I now is saying. It's more that
Mhm,
there is meaning in that moment that you're suffering. Maybe you're taking care of someone who's ill. Maybe you are ill. The meaning, maybe when you are ill, is who knows, but it's a very specific situation that you're in. Someone's meaning maybe just to get out of bed for the day. Again, very specific. Like you can't really even talk about without imposing your own values onto that situation. Like some saying, "Oh, it's
yeah,
good for you to get out of bed." I don't know, but maybe that is that person's experience. And like,
yeah.
and
Maybe your
so
meaning is learning to accept rest when you need it, right? Or it could
yeah.
be to learn to push yourself and go out of the bed. It's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's we got to be careful to not impose.
Yeah. Like, yeah, you can't, it's hard to talk about without kind of like examples, which also highlight like our own meaning, right? Which is different. But
Hmm.
that's, yeah, it's not so much about reaching for, if you're the farmer, to go back to the farmer, he's not watching his horse run away saying, oh, it'll be fine because because of this horse, my son might not go to war. Or I'm gonna, oh well, the horse running away is gonna help me create this business where I can now like teach people how to keep their horses contained. It's not that, it doesn't have to be. It's more just like, what is that intersection in that moment that I guess life is calling you to do, or is calling you to action, or I don't know how you would frame that actually. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's hard, it's abstract. I think some
Mm.
people take it, you could have a religious connotation to it, right? You could say
Mhm.
someone is calling me to action, or I have a purpose in this life that I am meant to fulfill in that specific way.
Mhm.
Or you could see it in a non-religious way too and just say, I want to take something from this, whether it's learning more about myself or understanding this type of experience more so I can understand others, or whatever it means. I think it is a spectrum.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. What is an example of where meaning is lost? I guess. I don't know. That's a big question, but maybe we can,
Hmm.
like, when somebody is feeling maybe or experiencing that there is no meaning. I guess what's the opposite state of that? I don't know if I'm making sense, but you know.
Like how do people lose meaning?
Yeah, like, especially I'm thinking during this time, like somebody who's just waiting for things to go back to normal and feeling distress in that waiting process, maybe like a.
Yeah, I'm
Mm-hmm.
we we I mean, that is a question of how we get meaning,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think we get meaning in different ways. So again, trying not to impose or
Mm-hmm.
project, but a lot of people's meanings were through their expression of who they are and through what they were able to do. People get
Right.
meaning through their work, and a lot of people are unemployed. People get meaning through relationships, and now they can't
Mm-hmm.
see those relationships or nurture those relationships in the same way. And so the reason why this topic is important, maybe I should have prefaced with that, is that people have lost their sense of meaning
Right.
because of that, because they're just blocked from doing that. And so it becomes, well, where is my meaning now? How do I
Right.
locate that now?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I think we can get meaning, this maybe gets into this just world hypothesis of believing that the world is predictable and believing that it's fair. And now we're faced with things that are really unfair and really uncertain. And that's a traumatic experience. And when people go through trauma or traumatic experiences, they also shatter their sense of meaning because their worldview is shattered. And the fact that we're talking about a new normal means that a normal and perception of our old lives was shattered.
Mm-hmm.
And so that leaves us picking up the pieces of trying to make sense of what that means, whether it's gaining our sense of purpose because we've lost that because our hobbies aren't accessible, or trying to make sense of it all, or trying to come up with a new way of seeing the world and interpreting it now that we know it's possible for something to change so drastically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. It's yeah, I think, and I don't know if it's next, but identity was one of the things.
Stop. I'm going to look at.
Is it?
Okay, we can. It
Well,
was
let's
goals
do it in
versus
order, but
values, but
that's
we
I
can
was
go.
like, that'd be hilarious.
I
But
don't mind.
that's great. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that that's what I was sort of palpating, was this sense of somebody who's like, I'm waiting for my, like, these pieces of my identity that have just been fragmented and drifted off to sort of reassemble. And
Yeah.
but and I think in this particular person actually that I'm thinking of, I won't share any details, but um I think that person, I think we're always in a search for meaning, but we may not know or acknowledge or frame it in that way. And so maybe it's even like, oh, how has my identity shifted slightly just given the new normal?
Yeah.
What am I up to now? What am I interested now? Where's my attention now? um and that may also provide some insight into, like, what is meaningful right now, or like what is, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And another thing, I guess this will be the nice transition that we
Yeah.
have because we love the nice
Yeah.
transitions. Um, is we another way that you get your meaning is by having goals in your life and achieving those goals. And right now we're in a position where if we can't have a definitive future, we can't necessarily have definitive goals to rely on. It's harder to just achieve goals because, again, the ecosystem is our home. And so a lot of our goals that we were working on have changed or moved, and the pace is slower, and it's more frustrating to be in that state of, there's a lot of people who keep pushing back their weddings.
Yeah.
There's people who have goals about their businesses that now they have to reroute the way they orient their business, and maybe they have different expectations and projections now. So the focus on goals can put us in a state of deprivation in this moment. It can contribute to our struggle and our frustration, which is why it can be helpful to orient our lives through values. And that can also color and help add meaning if we're talking about how abstract meaning is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, what are values? What are goals? Values are actions that can always be followed. So that can be they're qualities of being. It's to be adventurous, it's to be curious, right? You never achieve curious. It's not something like achievement unlocked. It's something that you can follow all the time to the best of your ability. You can connect with it. Whereas goals are things that you can't necessarily always connect to every day. They're far away. They don't fill you up because, you're waiting to get it. So another example would be, two kids in a car going to Disney World. And the one kid who's goal oriented is focused on going to Disney World, and they're saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are you there? Are we there yet?" And you're just in that state of frustration and anxiety and waiting. Whereas the other kid, if they have that value for curiosity and adventure, is counting the cows out the window and looking at the colors in the sky and like rocking to the music on the way. And then they both get to Disney World and they both enjoy it. But then once that's done, the high goes down, and either the kid who was just focused on Disney World is like, when can we go back again? Or when can I go to Universal Studios? Or are we there yet? Are we home yet? Whereas the other kid might be like, oh, the world looks different at night when I see it through this window, and just focusing on the experience. So right now, if we're talking about adventure, that can feel like something that was taken away from us. You can't travel the world right now. It's not advised, blocked sometimes, but you can live your full adventure maybe by cooking a new recipe, right? It's just finding a way to access it as much as you can.
Yeah. 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 Even like service, or what are the other, I think identifying our values, our core values, could be helpful too. Like there are lists you can kind of find on the internet of like values and circle your top 10 kind of thing. And that's always like enlightening, because you're like, oh wow, I didn't realize that, like, this one is not really, I don't even care, and this one is like, ooh, or these are like, I'm deciding between 10 and 11. And but that's really, I like that analogy with the Disney World, because they both have the goal of getting to Disneyland. It's not like the one looking at cows is not happy to go to Disneyland, but it's even like, what are you going to get out of Disneyland is probably his curiosity and sense of adventures driving him to even want to be there, and it's going to help that goal happen, but also be more enriching, but then even the journey there. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it can seem sometimes daunting, like, oh, can't travel, and travel for me has been like oxygen. And but what is there, like I always bring up, and it's on my Instagram, like the Great Lake surfing, right? And it's not with the intention of like go surf, like it's not, it's that my point with it that I'm still amazed at is that there was this, so certain values like adventure and athleticism and whatever led me to even care about that, but this is an opportunity that was hidden in plain sight that I had no idea existed, totally changed my life. And it's not going to be that for everyone, but it was just this like wow moment of this kind of thing. I don't need to, before my thought was like, I have to live in Hawaii or I have to live in California or live in Costa Rica or wherever to be someone who surfs regularly. And it was simply not true. And so I think that, it's like, maybe you traveled the world regularly and now you're like exploring all these different types of cuisine, you know? And I think, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's there of course, like, y there's lots of things that people have lost in this,
Mhm.
right? So what can be helpful is if you used to get a lot of energy from vacationing, let's say, because that's our topic, but you can't do that now. Write down the reasons why vacation
Mhm.
matters to you from a values perspective.
Mhm.
What do you get out of it? Oh, I get meeting new people. So that's the value of openness, or that's the value of intimacy. I get adventure. I get curiosity. And so you write all of those things down. Those things are still accessible
Mhm.
in some capacity,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that goal is not accessible right now, but the value is, you can, even if it's not the same magnitude, it
Right.
is something you can touch base with.
Yeah. Yeah, because we need that. Like, you need to be living in accordance with your values, or you're going to feel a disconnect. You're not going to feel good. So
Yeah.
maybe travel is the way that, wow, like everything came together and all your values were manifested, and you felt this crazy magnitude of everything, just this huge sense of fulfillment. And you're like, I don't get that from like going to the grocery store, getting a couple ingredients and making pad thai. But there, you're still honoring the values that are essential. It's like, um,
Mhm.
yeah, and
Or
we
for
don't know. Yeah.
businesses, one of them could be, again, I don't want to say what someone is losing or has lost. So these are
Yeah.
all just hypothetical. But
Yeah.
let's say business, a lot of it is like, the sense of mastery, the sense
Mhm.
of conquering something. So if we extract mastery, okay, where can we find mastery in life? Does
Mhm.
that mean that your brain is the type of brain that wants to learn something new, if it's possible? And I know we've talked about motivation and being easy on yourself. Do you want to incorporate mastery in your life in some way?
Mhm. Yeah. 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 And that's why coming up with examples feels like we're just like, well, learn how to Rubik's Cube. It's not that, because that's why
I
it's not
know.
good.
I
But
know. You have to be so careful, right? Again, this is not easy. And if you
exactly.
also don't want to do anything, this is a hard time. You
Yeah.
don't have to do anything. If nothing makes you
Exactly.
feel good, that's okay.
Exactly. But I
Right?
think
I'm
this
not
is
going to say,
yeah.
yeah, why don't you do a Rubik's Cube?
Yeah, but this is it. It's the goo
Yeah.
versus the prickles, like Alan Watts says that. So it's like, okay, so the actual things are, you lost your business, now you're Rubik's cubing. That's not, or you used to travel the world, now
Oh,
you're cooking dinner.
yes.
That's not what we're saying.
Yeah.
It's all the goo in between. That maybe that is, it's like my client that, or my patient that would walk to and from work, kind of like at the end of the day. It's like, if I came up with that solution, it would feel completely invalidating. Oh, just go like walk. Maybe I do that to patients. I'm
Yes.
sorry if you're listening and I
Yeah.
have done that. But but um but I think it's that the person came to their own conclusion, and based on what you're offering, which is to examine the values. And it may not be the
Hmm.
same, it may not even be close, but it's in some way feeding the desire to live in accordance with our values, which may be a huge part of why we're suffering because of a loss, um
Yes. Yes. This is no way, yeah, we're not equating losing your business, the grief, the financial hardship,
Mhm,
the uncertainty of that, to
mhm,
just be okay with it, just be uncertain
mhm,
farmer and
mhm,
get a Rubik's Cube. Like, there's, like,
mhm,
we have to have this as a caveat. I love that you pulled that out, because that's important.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, but it's how we acknowledge and work with the material, I think, is could be helpful, right? And again,
Mhm.
this is also like, we're
Mhm.
this is very general suggestions. Like, you're not working one to one. When you're working one to one with someone, it's probably, well, I know it looks very, very different, right? You're really unpacking it,
Mhm.
working through this together. And like we said, maybe we're just staying in validation for most of the conversation, Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I really like that because, you know, let's say you're a person that really thrives on going to restaurants regularly, trying new restaurants, and now you can't, and you just feel an incredible sense of frustration, loss, all kinds of emotions. To be able to understand why it is you loved to go to restaurants so much. And then, that could also just be validating. Like, okay, that's why I feel so much grief that I've lost this, because all of these
Mhm.
important things to me that are deep are not being honored, right? Okay. And then it provides an opportunity potentially, to, okay, well, I need then, I don't know, to sit in beautiful spaces and people
Yes.
watch.
I'm an aesthetic person. I need
Yeah.
to decorate my house and make my
Yeah.
kitchen gorgeous like a beautiful
Yeah,
restaurant.
or
Yeah,
have
like
beautiful things, and so,
yeah,
because it's not gonna be the same solution for everyone. Getting takeout may not solve that problem if that's not what it
yeah.
was, if it wasn't about the food. Maybe sitting on a park bench and watching people is who knows? So, but it's the values piece that I think that's so important to acknowledge,
Mhm.
when we're trying to cope, Um, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. What's next? We've got
Ooh, I was on mute. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's
Um,
okay.
so we also have the coping with the lack of physical touch.
Yes.
This is a hard piece.
Mhm.
Um, it's we know that it's important in regulating our mood. We know that primates will groom each other as stress relief. Like physical touch is
Mhm.
very integral as part of our being. So how do we do that? And I invite you to help talk about this with me because I think this is a more tricky topic.
Mhm.
Again, I could say, I mean, what I have is being conscious that your body is also something that's needing input, not just your mind. And we've sort of touched on that with self care and the different self care boxes, the five senses, grounding, doing five sense activities, baths.
Mhm.
There's also self holds that you can look up online where you take a blanket around and you wrap it around your shoulders and you squeeze really tight.
Mhm.
Things that give you this sense of touch or try to mimic it as much as possible, and just identifying that that's a need. Even if you take time to put your hand on your chest
Mhm.
and focus and feel the warmth flowing from your hand into your body, what does that feel like? How does it feel to self-soothe? This is especially a topic, right? I think this, as I'm speaking now, I'm thinking of people who are living alone.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is a hard, yeah. Um, I think that my it's like we talked about in the last episode, it's not so much something that shows up as a craving, although it does show up as a craving, but the lack of it is, and sometimes that craving can be unbearable because it can't be resolved, but underneath it, I think, is just this ongoing lack of something that we, as you said, is essential to our well-being. Just there's just no way around it, just like food and shelter and all of these things, and there are different degrees of how long we can go without them and what the effects of deprivation of these things are. So it's not the same as going without food, like we
Mhm.
mentioned, but there's still real effects of not having touch. And just like going without food, people are going to feel the pain of that at different times and in different ways. Lack of touch is going to show up differently for people. And I I think sometimes, like, when I talk to patients about, self holds, like hands on the chest or hugging yourself, um and it's like, yeah, I think when it gets to the level of craving, then it's
Yeah.
like, that's not going to do it. I want someone to like hold
Yeah.
me, or a specific person, or um
Mhm, mhm.
I think, though, just part of, as you're talking, it's reminding me of the last topic of the values and the goals. And when I think that a lot of, at least for me, what being touched helps. So first of all, we know the chemical responses like oxytocin release, and which calms us down, provides this sense of connection, serotonin, like we feel this warm feeling. So again, it's not like you lose your business, so now you're Rubik's cubing, but it's a little bit of a I'm recreating some of those self-soothing aspects that touch delivered, like warmth um, and some of those oxytocin responses. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
feeling full, like, and sometimes we can shame ourselves for overeating, but to recognize that that's a self-soothing mechanism, and just to kind of acknowledge that, and um but also body awareness, like being embodied. This is this thing that comes up a lot in my podcast, but and just in conversations, but how much time we spend in our mental space. And one of the things that touch helps for me is to like embody me. So what are some of the ways that can help with that? It's yeah, like for me it's yoga, I have to just say. Like, I think that the thing with yoga that I've always liked is that I'm like, I have this different perspective. Like, I'm just thinking of one pose where you're like on the floor, you're looking under your armpit, your legs are up. Like, I never do that unless I'm doing yoga. I don't even know I could do that. And it's not a particularly difficult pose or anything like that. It's just a weird, and it stretches certain muscles. But I am engaging with my body. Parts of my body are touching. I'm looking at different perspectives of my body. I'm aware. I have to sort of balance in that posture. There's just certain things that bring me into my body. Restorative yoga probably is even more close to this, because you really are just
Mhm.
nourishing your physical home. Um, with lots of blankets and things and tactile sensations that mimic touch. But yeah, I mean, there's that experiment that I'm sure you're aware of, that they take baby monkeys and they give them a mechanical like wire mother that has food and water, like
Yeah.
milk, and then they give them a stuffed monkey that's more like the warmth of the mom, and they'll just cuddle the fuzzy monkey and reject the water instead of getting the wire mother that's actually providing the food. So we actually do go to touch and to connection more than even food and water,
Mhm.
because that's a signal of of safety. Like, that is what regulates our nervous system. So I think I've been listening to stuff more often, like having a podcast on, and I wondered about that. I was like, why am I always, because it's hearing voices, hearing conversation,
Yeah.
having people there. And sometimes when it's mindless, non-heavy conversation, that's better. Like,
Mhm.
it's, I don't want them to talk about like science or stuff. Maybe maybe I just want to like hear people chattering about stuff. um yeah, it's a tough one. I think it's sort of like the other one, the values and goals topic, where it's really, you know it's acknowledging that touch in and of itself is needed, and then there's also certain things that it provides, and um some of those things are like
And
embodied.
also some things are irreplaceable.
Yeah, yeah,
There are some things that are irreplaceable. It's not a direct replacement,
yeah, yeah,
like you said. Yeah.
yeah. I think, yeah, tactile sensation, pets, self holds, physical warmth. So this is like baths or
Mhm.
just wrapping up in blankets, heaviness on the body, um, movement practices. So could be yoga, could be tai chi, could be restorative yoga. It, could be just like, yeah, self holds, like hugging your knees to your chest. Yeah, I know. And then considering or framing these things as like a temporary measure to get through. Like, I'm holding on to this life raft as I wait
Yeah.
for the storm to pass. Um, but I think even just acknowledging that this is something we need, could be.
It's so funny. In the first session when we talked about just what is going on in validation, it was all like, okay, we validated, but like now what? And
Yeah.
now we're talking about now what? And we're like, yeah,
Just
you know what?
validate
Maybe
it.
we just need validation.
I know.
Right? But that's what it is. It's this cycle, right? So
Mhm,
again, like we're talking about all of these things that are ideas, and it doesn't mean that if you go through this whole list, you're gonna be
mhm,
great.
mhm.
You might find one thing out of this entire podcast that maybe
Yeah,
elevates your life just a little bit or relieves just 2% off of everything you're carrying. And that's still important. That's still useful. And
yeah,
also, yeah, at the end of the day, the validation piece is still the most important part.
yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, because without the validation, you know, all of it, it's like all of it just comes from a place of should and striving and more like,
Yeah.
and more
Yes.
potentially self-criticism, shame, fear, all that. So to just, yeah, like I really want to hug right now. Yeah, wrapping myself up in
Mhm.
blankets, especially if you have a I think I think it's James Hillman. He talks about our, oh, I hope I get this right. He talks about like a lack, so a feeling of loneliness or wanting touch. He's like, well, that if you watch it, if you watch the psychological content, he's a psychoanalyst, right? So it's different perspective on things. But he's like, you watch that lack, there's an image there. The imagination starts to take place, and then often we have in our mind the person we want to touch, who we want to touch us. So you have an image, and there's probably a situation around that image. You have like, you know, maybe they're like whisking you off on a white horse, or maybe they're, or maybe you're just in a comfort. Maybe it's a familiar. Maybe it's not so fantastical. Maybe it's just like a familiar situation that's happened before that you're just missing. But it's still an image. It's still an image, part of the imagination coming out, right? Even if it is a memory. And so it's like watching that happen that helps us access our inner child, is which is the thing producing images, according to him, which is even deeper than that immediate lack or longing, right? It's talking about longing. Now you have an image. Now you have access to the child. What's the child longing for? Something even deeper. It's not just that one hug. It's maybe so much more. Maybe it's that connection. Maybe is this biological thing. He says it's like a longing for the beyond. You know, like it
Mhm.
gets metaphysical real fast. But then he's like, what then you start to what starts with a lack in a deficiency, like a lack of something, starts to be filled with things, an image, a longing, a desire. And he's like, because you don't lack something when you have desire, you're filled with desire, and that's a very different feeling. It's more of a propelling, more fiery, more heat inducing feeling. So, and he's like, this is just in staying with the sensation of longing. So I think I'm always using myself, but I think because these are such deep concepts that it's hard to not personalize them. But you know this need for touch will show up as a longing. It will usually have an image, like especially, you know when I was single, it is like, oh, I want it to, like, I want a partner, like it has a very specific desire, like thing that I was lacking. And then that it was like, okay, but is it the partner? What else is it? Like, oh, it's a deeper need to be seen, to be connected with, to be merging with someone, deeper intimacy. And then that leads to more of a, and then I would also watch that sort of transform. It's not easy. It's not like, oh, it made everything better. It's not what I'm saying, but it was more like, oh, okay, there's a desire here for intimacy, for connection, for partnership, for
Yeah.
for merging with another being, for not being an individual or isolated, these bigger concepts. And um what does that desire do? It I don't know. In my case, I don't remember, but I think there's some possibilities I can imagine in like how it, you may reach out, or it may mobilize. I don't know if that makes sense, but just an interesting thing that he brought up. Like when we are longing for something, when we're lacking for something, um, what emerges from that experience of staying in the
Mhm.
longing, or recognizing,
Mhm.
validating it is a is a simple way to sort of frame that. But yeah.
That visualization can help make it a little bit more tangible,
Yeah.
the untangible piece of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And to feel, I mean, yeah, like, okay, it's not here right now. There's a specific image that I have that I want. And that's connecting to deeper values, like you said.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I can't create that image right now, um, but what does it inspire me to do? Or what follows from that image? Um,
Mhm.
yeah, engaging the imagination, I guess. So, um,
Mhm. Yeah,
yeah.
if I'm fantasizing about something or ruminating about an image in my mind, what's that tell me about what I'm needing right now? If
Hmm.
I'm finding some type of solace or experience in this image.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. See, I was
Mm.
framing so well. That's perfect. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, and then that goes into the beautiful last point is
Hmm.
seeking connection, seeking help.
Hmm.
I think this is just another, I mean, again, we can say go seek connection, like though it's not that simple. We're all deprived of it.
Hmm.
But I guess the important point is if you need to talk to somebody about it, whether it's your friend or whether it's a therapist, it's okay
Hmm.
to seek help and to talk about all this stuff that's going on.
Hmm.
And if none of this stuff applies to you, or only some of this stuff applies to you, or you're getting some ideas, but you need to personalize it for yourself, that can be a helpful starting point for you to start to do that. Because that's the thing, this podcast is not able to personalize and cover all experiences. And in some ways, that might sound invalidating or condescending, or, just not be able to connect. And in other things, you might connect. So, I enjoy talking to you about this stuff, and it can be really helpful. And you need other people to also be part of that
Hmm.
that reflection to bounce your ideas off of, to get other perspectives, to reframe something differently, to help organize your thoughts and help you better understand yourself.
Yeah. Even if it's just the validation through shared experience.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
to hear somebody say, "Oh yeah, like that," having I even just like, people sharing like things about having to homeschool their kids while they're at home and working from home and
Yeah.
that kind of thing, and just knowing like, oh yeah, nobody's going to know how to do this well. Nobody is particularly, well, I'm not going to say no one's enjoying it, but it's completely uncharted territory, and a lot of people are experiencing similar things. It's that common humanity, of like
Mhm.
people are feeling this too. It's an abnormal response to an abnormal situation. Aka it's normal. Yeah.
It hit me when you said common humanity.
Mhm.
Like you said last time we spoke, there's this discussion of we're all in this together, we're all in this together, and in many ways we're very different. And those differences are highlighted. They're also highlighted politically. People are on different sides, people are not speaking or agreeing with each other. And yet there's a common experience of helplessness. There's a common experience of lack of certainty. And people also feel like they don't have a right to speak to their friend. Oh, well, I'm not a single parent, so why can I complain about being a parent, or
Yeah.
whatever it is? And that just creates more barriers and causes us to suffer this alone, when there's so much that can come
Mhm.
from reaching out and remembering your common humanity and connecting. And even if you can't understand each other, that person can still validate you or reframe it for you from this different perspective that they have. It's so important to remember, if you have access to that, to use that. And if you don't, there are resources for you. There's support groups, there's therapists, there's podcast hosts, that like that
Yeah.
you can listen and get some ideas.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
so keep reaching out,
Yeah.
keep exploring.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I think that's a great last point. It's like, yeah, there's this program called Wild Five Wellness, and it's like a mental health kind of lifestyle program. And one of it's 5 wild five different categories. And one is the social connection, and it's like to call or talk to, like either in person or like on the phone, 2 people a day. And they're like, it seems simple, but how many days, if I think about that, some days go by, I do not do that. Sometimes it's a text conversation. Is that the same? And so now it's probably going to look more like phone. Um, but I think that, you know, yeah, the more that we're able to, we also sort things out by talking, a lot of us, but I think like to hear our own thoughts, to articulate some of what's going on can be really helpful, and yeah, it's hard to, because it's like, where do you start with that? Like some people have reached out, like I'm looking for a psychotherapist. I know there's a process in terms of finding a good fit and finding like what's the style and who's the person and can you afford it and are there free resources, and so sometimes that requires a bit of searching. um but it's, you know it may be helpful to just acknowledge that that's a need, and that's one of the things. It's sort of like in your self-care categories, it's like the social aspect of self-care, like how do we fill that box? um yeah. And
My AirPods lost battery, so I didn't want to interrupt
yeah,
you. Can you hear me okay? Am I
yeah, I
different?
can hear you.
Plug into something else.
Yeah, I can hear you actually perfectly.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess that's also like maybe a cue. The ear pods are like, okay. We're, but any last thoughts, any last summary that you like? Thank you so much. I think this is a really, I always say this at the end of like, I don't know if I should say this at the end of like my own podcast, but I'm like, this is such a great episode. But like, I don't know. Yeah. I guess I don't feel like personally responsible for the whole production. I'm like, it was a great conversation. Um, yeah, so many things that you mentioned, I feel like were helpful. I mean, it's not so much these like concrete suggestions, which I think is the important thing. It's like even creating the self-care chart, or answering Viktor Frankl's questions about meaning. Like these are really helpful places to start, that could help someone. So, I think this has been really good. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah, Victoria. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your time. And yeah, well, maybe we'll have, I mean, so this is going to be on YouTube and also in the podcast. So people can provide some feedback. Let us know, what was helpful, what you're doing, if there's anything else maybe we can address, or any links that maybe we could find for you. Yeah,
Yeah.
let us know.
You're in it too. Everyone's an expert in the pandemic, because as far as I know, there hasn't been decades of research on it. There's no playbook for it. There's no, right? Like there's no center dedicated for it, maybe now, but this is all new to us. How to cope in a pandemic is new.
Exactly.
There's
Yeah.
no right way. We're all just figuring this out together. And so you're also the expert. So if something doesn't feel right, or if there's something that we're missing,
Mm-hmm.
I believe you.
Exactly. Or yeah, if you've discovered something, some golden treasure in all this,
Yes.
let us know so we can
Link
spread the
golden
word.
treasure.
Yeah. If you know. And this
Yeah.
is it. It's like, I mean, I don't want to jump into a whole new topic, but this idea that our there's so many different needs, I think is the main point I want to make. We all have individual needs, we have community needs, we have family needs, and then there's this population wide need. So being able to come up with solutions based on these grassroots needs that you're encountering, and if you have those, let us know.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah.
Grassroots needs,
Yeah.
not top down.
Exactly. Yeah. Bottom up. What's some bottom up solutions? Or I don't want to say solutions. What is, I don't know. What do
Bottom up
you,
insight.
yeah, what do you exactly, what's some insight? What's your Flutterboard looking like right now? Like what are you holding on to right now? Like tell us.
Mm-hmm.
What's your surfboard look like? Maybe we'll
Yeah.
just end on surfing again. Yeah. So thank you so much, Victoria. This is so great.
Thanks for having me.